Okay, now officially, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm very happy that today we are hosting three speakers coming from three continents at the moment. I would like to briefly just introduce them and then to leave the floor to them to give us as many information as possible about this very interesting topic. I'm happy actually to present, an honor to present Robin Freeman, who is co-director of the Ronald Dellums Institute for Sustainable Policy Studies and Chair Emeritus of Environmental Management and Technology Department at the Merritt College. Honomi Ijima, a research associate at the Vice President of the Fukuoka Oakland Friendship Association, and Steve Rauch, Executive Director of the Manitoba Center for Families in Transition. So today they will present the findings of their project on unifying social psychological narratives of peace. Their findings briefly suggest that psychological careers and research can make an important contribution to social inclusion, post-traumatic growth, and positive peace narratives in public spheres. Psychologists' work can mitigate unintended catastrophic crises that accumulate into what they describe as an authoritarian stress condition. I have to admit that I don't really have lots of knowledge about this topic and the term authoritarian stress condition. So as much as our audience, I'm also excited to hear more about it. And also I hope that we will have a very fruitful Q&A discussion after the presentation. And as usual, Student and Early Career Committee YouTube channel will host this event for you to watch on demand. So that means that I will upload it immediately after we finish live recording. So I don't want to take more of your time. Everybody knows me. I'm Alma Jeftic. I'm currently the chair of Student and Early Career Committee at the APA Division 48. And as usual, I'm always happy to host events where our students and early career members can actually learn a lot and hear some new information. So in order not to engage too much, I'm happy to give a floor to our speakers. So the floor is yours, and you are free to share your screen.
Thank you, Alma.
I can see your screen now.
Okay. Well, first we'll begin with introductions. As you mentioned, I'm Robin Freeman, and it's 4:30 here in Oakland, California, San Francisco Bay Area. Honomi.
Sorry, my name is Honomi. I am coming from Kanagawa, Japan, which is south of Tokyo.
9:30 for you, I think, in the morning.
9:30 for me, yes, same as Alma.
And Steve.
And my name is Steve Rauch. I'm from Winnipeg, which is in the center of Canada. It's 6:30 here, 6:36. Thank you for having us, Alma.
Yes,
on this.
Thanks so much, Alma. Yeah. This is exciting because you're not the only one who hasn't heard of the authoritarian stress condition before. This is actually the first time we've had the opportunity to present these ideas outside of our own colleagues. We will explore how epidemic scale trauma impairs coherent well-being, and we will discuss opportunities to plan for preferred outcomes to reduce unintended consequences. We are sharing our hypotheses from 5 decades of applied action research about links between what may seem to be unimportant normal activities and their much larger outcomes. Our long human juvenile or developmental period gives us a lot of room to make choices in the balance between the givens of nature and nurture. Even with civilization, origin stories, or the need for navigating who and where we are in the world hasn't gone away. Our minds will automatically grope for coherence that these shared narratives can describe. As administrative group sizes increase, our sense of being able to affect where we live diminishes. Our anxiety increases, and we tend towards unstable extremes. We have a mixed spectrum of narratives ranging from attachment to trauma. Psychology can add some useful concepts to our narratives. We are an emotional, imaginative, and social animal that functions well under certain conditions and not so well under others. In a world that can be a paradise, there are also negative outcomes from our human activities. These result in stacked disasters on scales that seem overwhelming. In our analysis, we have named civilization's failure to thrive an authoritarian stress condition. Our concept of the authoritarian stress condition refers to a social scale version of PTSD. It copes with stress by controlling behavior and standardizing activities, which reduces attunement to the diversity of emotions and situations. As an example, this graph of our global tax use compares the cost of military harm to the relatively tiny World Health Organization caretaking budget. The positive aspect is that the WHO's projected cost to resolve the top 26 causes of global unrest that range from poverty to climate stabilization would cost just 2/3 of the US military budget. Except for advertising, most social sectors or professions don't regularly link the emotional effects of their missions. Don't regularly think of those. At the same time, much of the psychology community may not feel it can affect the general tenor of public situations or world events. We look at how patterns lead to outcomes rather than simply blaming individuals, groups, or ideologies for them. Patterns from what is called big history illustrate how extremely recent it is that we have exponentially filled the globe. Coming out of Africa, everybody went everywhere, bred with everybody else, and lived in every imaginable way. Indigenous migratory groups avoided stress by giving each other room when they could. When migratory small groups could move away, they didn't have to craft their way out of large-scale social stress and its catastrophic results. Until recently, on this time scale, it was adaptive to stay away from people when you couldn't come to an understanding. Until the last 2 centuries, the world was profoundly rural. Our interactive social skills evolved in small, familiar groups. There was less hierarchy and much more collaboration and oral information sharing. For instance, in 1800, only 3% of the world's population lived in cities, and most people had never seen one. The organization of urban empires has been remarkably similar everywhere. Collaborative living skills are replaced with non-productive administrative classes, skill specialization, and centralized coordination, which includes large military and underclass or slave sectors. However, monumental city-states and catastrophic large-scale violence did not develop everywhere over the same period of time. Under differing conditions, our capacity for technology has come up with remarkably different results. These three disciplines help understand how patterns of harmful or thriving conditions become more probable. The random odds are not on our side for finding livable conditions, even on Earth. We do exist, and we have been waving at the solar system and beyond, but no one has waved back yet, as far as we can tell. So equilibrium in both biology and psychology is a state in which most individuals are living within their optimal ecological zone. For humans, it requires a conscious balancing act to live within the relatively narrow niche in which we thrive. Living within a safe, optimal niche is not automatic, nor can it be accomplished by a few leaders. Since most of our skills are learned, we need to broadly craft our shared goals to manage harm and maximize care. This is more natural seeming in less crowded indigenous landscapes. But we can't put civilization back in the bottle. However, we can develop narratives that are useful in the present. Rather than splitting between simple good and bad, we can craft narratives that include everyone and everything all the time. In cities, that may seem impossibly overwhelming. It seems more our nature when we are in smaller, more manageable settings. But we don't need to despair of human nature, just understand it. We have inherited a damaged self-image of hostile aggression, like this scientific illustration of the National Geographic magazine. This is still a commonly held perception, although for some time, archaeologists, for instance, have come to, quote, abandon familiar notions of early man as a blundering primitive. This brings us to more current understandings of psychology that Steve will address.
Thank you, Robin. So in the past 70 years, psychological theory has increasingly focused on these three interrelated areas of mental health. We will look at how they help us understand our inclination to behave adaptively or maladaptively. The three theories help us understand how children react to stress and what supports their well-being. When experiencing stress, children can become depressed, agitated, or both. In my clinical practice with highly distressed families, we would use a weave illustration to help parents visualize how children develop. In secure environments, the weave threads come together in a sense of wholeness and belonging for the children. You can see how the threads of the caretakers weave together here to help form the child's inner sense of personhood. As Robin depicted earlier, there are split extremes in civilization's narratives. Disrupted families are split between good and bad, right and wrong. Emotional safety is elusive for the children, especially when their caretakers are in conflict. When family conflict persists, the child experiences loyalty binds and the weave is pulled apart. When the internal threads do not interweave, there is no sense of emotional cohesion. The child seeks safety or acknowledgement in the red zones, as elusive as it may be, of the continuum at the bottom of this illustration. This still face video, first developed by Dr. Edward Tronick in 1975, shows the weave as a coherent in an attachment relationship. And it shows the frayed weave when the child's relationship is interrupted. Let's watch what happens.
Babies in the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes.
As mental health clinicians, we focus our attention on our client's dysregulation, as seen in the video when the child's mother becomes inattentive. Typically, we refer to the gray area between extremes as the space for additional options. But for purposes of our discussion about co-parents, it is also important to focus on the moments of delight and connection between the mother and the child. These encounters critically allow us to develop the capacities to engage and thrive. We are noting these moments as social experiences of interplay. They are represented here by the rainbow that connects the extremes. Interplay experiences nurture emotional and cognitive growth and are essential to our coherent development. We use D.W. Winnicott's concept of a holding environment as a way to refer to the nature of this safely supportive experience. Winnicott observed the important need to extend the holding environment beyond the family to the community and society as a whole. His concept contrasts greatly with the restrictive dysregulated self-concept inherent in civilization's authoritarian stress conditions that Robin introduced earlier. The holding environment not only provides safety, but it provides a kind of delight and a sense of enduring belonging that animates our experiences of one another and our world. In the nursery, it provides the seeds of hope, and socially, it provides emotional space for a heightened shared sense of hope and agency. Returning to our coherent weave, the holding environment then would include our social and physical environments as well as our immediate caretakers, as represented in the additional brown and blue threads in this illustration. This is an extension of what we normally think of in mental health. In civilization, a sense of coherence is elusive. In holding environments, a social, psychological, and environmental coherence would predominate, as depicted in this graph introduced by Robin, but used here to represent a homeostatic psychological niche. The red dysregulated areas outside the niche contain relatively little activity. On the other hand, the authoritarian stress we attribute to civilization, which we can think of as a legacy condition, results from and causes developmental arrest, chronic stress, and repeated crisis. These are givens that many of civilization's narratives treat as normal. But there is considerable psychological and historical evidence that they are not inevitable, nor are they our fault. Central to authoritarian stress is the human reaction to trauma. Trauma, first widely recognized in World War I as shell shock and more recently as PTSD, is typically thought of as a single dramatic or overwhelming event. But based on neuroscience and endocrinology, we know it can result from more subtle accumulated experiences. These can also be understood as attachment injuries, much like that captured in the child's distress in the still face video. The psychological responses to trauma, especially in childhood, begins in the coping reaction to seek immediate safety, but it later becomes a barrier to emotional growth because it impairs a person's ability to know coherence and well-being. Without emotional growth, human development becomes stuck, or as we say in psychology, arrested. Some of us seem to be resilient to many of these effects, but society as a whole, it could be said, struggles with varied and accumulated states of arrested development, which now endanger our future. When social psychological conditions are under stress, we might depict a social weave similar to the child's internally distressed and frayed weave. Accumulating the frayed weaves into a graph, we can see how the authoritarian stress condition can be depicted here. Civilization as a whole is excessively in both the aggressive agitation of hyperarousal and the withdrawn state of hypoarousal. There is not enough coherence to sustain well-being. In what follows, Robin will address how we can minimize this condition to achieve the more robust sense of well-being and thriving that emerges from holding environments.
Thanks, Steve. So continuing on with the civilization scale of narratives, we look at probable consequences under conditions of authoritarian stress. There's not a commonly shared language for peace other than absence of war. Thus, with little actual information about what peace is, we are more likely to conduct the wars that we are prepared for, while peace remains a vague concept in some other world. Our daily activities accumulate in ways that can be explained with systems theory. It appears all too often that history repeats itself, like this circle on the right, seeming to be a simple splitting between good and bad extremes. Things don't change. They feel stuck and hopeless. But by expanding the cycle of repetition, which is the circle on the top here, dotted line, to include time and space, this helix reveals a very dynamic beyond just good and bad. The central vector, the white arrow, indicates the general direction of the whole system. Chaos theory was originally developed to show how less predictable daily weather accumulates into more predictable long-term climate conditions. Chaotic systems like weather or society are resistant to change if they reach storm or epidemic scales. However, and importantly, they are extremely sensitive to initial conditions. Chaos theory suggests then that you can influence the direction of large chaotic systems by initiating new side systems. Here, the helix is redrawn to show our current exponential scales. The main direction is a byproduct of billions of small vectors. They accumulate into the huge energy of narrative-driven actions, swinging into the maladaptive outcomes of social and climate disasters. This hypothesis, or at least our hypothesis, suggests that if we intentionally and thoughtfully link many smaller side initiatives, like this one, they can cumulatively change the effect of the whole while sustaining their own enriched collaborative characteristics. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead famously observed, scale is inversely proportional to nuanced or attuned effectiveness. Oversized scales diffuse or break the essential feedback loops that balance perception and can result in unintended catastrophic behavioral outcomes. This can be applied to a spectrum of social network types. These range from weak but rapidly spreading links of simple imitation or obedience that characterize coordination to the much slower but richer engagement of complex interplay that characterizes collaboration. The legacy burden of overscaled authoritarian systems inadvertently recauses unnecessary crisis conditions, like in the bottom graph that Steve showed. The top graph shows that the window of tolerance for diverse conditions is wider as coherence increases. In the last century, what is known about human nature, as well as the nature of matter and energy, has been used with catastrophic outcomes. Edouard Bernays invented modern advertising. His uncle, Sigmund Freud, observed that people are more strongly moved by emotions than by reason alone. Using that and his own observations of the viral effects of his World War I propaganda, Bernays was able to get women to smoke cigarettes and infamously founded the Council on Public Relations. Our hypothesis suggests that a maladaptive ratio between caring and harming is not inevitable. Unlike the infrastructures of medical research that test healthy protocols, in public policy, there is little shared attunement about how positive experiences make their way through social systems. Successful pilot projects repeatedly go unnoticed and thus produce little systemic learning that would be required for coherent public policy. So what is the nature of solutions? Our data corroborates that, as Hannah Arendt philosophized, it is not giving specific plans, but framing conversations about how to identify what makes hopes actionable rather than otherworldly and inaccessible. At the top of this complicated figure of solutions, the many smaller green side vectors collaborate to bring the whole direction within the optimal zone. Now, what would support this process? First, because of the trauma caused by authoritarian systems, a level of healing triage is necessary before assembling solutions. The pain of maladaptive experiences in the red zones in the graphs can create dysfunctional withdrawal, addictive symbolic dissociation from real situations, and dysregulated forms of anger. Fortunately, trauma-informed care and post-trauma growth are emerging globally to address pains that have been too great to bear. They can also help reduce developmental arrest impasses from colonial learned helplessness or disbelief in the importance of local decisions. For inclusion, we use this social media phrase to suggest the critical importance of a sense of belonging throughout life. Safe inclusion is where the human imagination interacts the world with space for envisioning beyond pain. Rich, variant dreams in which nothing seems to be missing can come from anywhere and everywhere as the basis for planning. These coherent experiences can't be forced, but emerge from our native capacities. Steve shared this from his clinical practice to show how psychology can provide for structures for growth. However, authoritarian institutionalized barriers actually intensify a general experience of isolation. Coherence is a core Native American capacity. Like with individuals, we can identify pockets of coherence in society and build on those. It helps address the imposter syndrome. Who am I to take responsibility? Which is one of the more damaging effects of authoritarian stress. We have real human resources, even though they are currently in the margins of the central narratives. Every sector of society has some understanding in their own language of this endless resource. These existing resources can be integrated to address disbelief in order to envision the plan within this world. It is not so much cherry picking spectacular solutions, but recognizing the millions of solutions already in action. Can they be linked so they can emerge into suites of robust activities? Rather than centralized authorities and public spectacles, these millions of local initiatives are the resources that have the capacity to stabilize the globe. Though they may be floating around in the margins, they are actually prefiguring the world you want to see. As we conclude, we will revisit Honomi Ijima's connections in the upper left background of this photo. Although the authoritarian stress condition suppresses imagination and community, these resources reliably reemerge. For instance, Denzel Brown's research in the previous event that Alma hosted on post-trauma growth, the word community was the most common word. In our own work from 1969 to the present, we began with questions raised by our experiences with young children and in the Sierra Mountains from which we developed these hypotheses. In our locations, we tested them for proof of concept through applications at multiple developmental stages and in multiple sectors. During the same period, 7,000 miles away along the Yellow River, this high desert landscape was transformed into a lush river valley in 25 years by a village working largely with hand tools, bicycles, and a small consulting group. It demonstrates how both carbon and social balances can develop throughout the global ecosystem, with everyone fed while providing a beautiful place to live and work. Steve accidentally stumbled across it in an article in The Guardian. But why does something like this seem impossible when living in outer space or vaporizing and irradiating millions of people is commonly accepted? I found this recent, carefully worded reference to it at the far edges of mainstream Western educated industrial rich democracy or weird science. However, this story and millions of others remain largely unrecognized in the margins of public narratives. Along with authoritarian stress, pockets of coherence persist. Our legacy of institutional and narrative barriers marginalize and isolate them, which creates an empty feeling in which the center cannot hold, as the poet Yeats described. We borrow the phrase centering the margins from an international artist exchange which included our environmental justice Creekside show, Creekside Greenway and Bench in their show. Research on how medical advances have emerged suggests intentionally framing conversations with a plenitude of ideas about how to link suites of diverse adaptive activities towards a locally managed, interconnected globe where the center does hold. In theory, giving these robust recognition will support a shared background narrative of trust that people around the world are actively caring for their local coherence. And like Winnicott's holding environment, the stress condition of hyper and hypoarousal will be low enough that we won't feel that we have to be looking over our shoulders all the time. We have the opportunity to identify and robustly support the optimal zones where each of us is. It may seem counterintuitive that it is good enough to plan practical activities where you are that keep the magic and wonder in mind. An institute next step will be to address institutional barriers with public conversations. By supporting cross-sector conversations, we hope to help understand what preconditions increase the probability of thriving outcomes in both the built environment and public policy. In order to story our more intimate scales with their global consequence over spans of time and space. Hannah Arendt described the millions of remarkable daily activities in the Nazi system as the banality of evil. The equally unrecognized converse of that could be seen as the banality of good. If there's a shared trust that people around the world are actively moving towards being locally coherent in their day-to-day actions, it answers the question, who am I to have a global impact? We have considered where we are in a shared story of mitigating epidemic trauma with coherent well-being and who we are to take responsibility and of what kind. In this tiny little dot, we are at the point in our own research to invite thoughts and collaboration and your thoughts. I was advised by a mentor early in my work not to wait for money, but to go ahead and begin doing whatever I could, and the money would follow. It took a long time, but it eventually did. With peace theory, we are on the edges of weird science. As an example, in creating Abrir, Alma is addressing access from marginalized sectors to mainstream science. At the Institute, we can share some stipends as we move towards funding more collaboration. As we conclude with Honomi Ijima's recent project about our Pacific Rim watersheds and their people, perhaps Zoom and the internet are now at the level that the Gutenberg Press was in 1440 for robustly sharing previously untold stories across what have been barriers of culture, class, and space. Honomi?
Thank you, Robin. So I am going to talk about specifically the Fukuoka Oakland Friendship Association's Watershed Day, which was a part of the summer exchange program in July of this year. But before that, I'll quickly go over what's the history of Sister City program, and specifically Sister City connection between Fukuoka, Japan, and Oakland, California. So this U.S. Sister City program began in 1956 when President Eisenhower proposed the People-to-People Citizen Diplomacy Initiative, which was much needed in the post-World War II era when collective trauma was rampant. Oakland, California, and Fukuoka, Japan, which is in the southern region of Japan, have been sister cities since 1962. The main program of our Sister City Connection has been the Youth Exchange Program for high school students, which began in 1970. Fukuoka Oakland Friendship Association, or FOFA, which I represent, was established in 2002, and we just turned 20 last year. It began as a group of former exchange students who wished to stay connected to each other, and over time, we evolved to become a grassroots group that support Fukuoka City's Sister City program with Oakland, California, to create meaningful, comforting, and peaceful experience for all participants. The picture of students having a nice time out in the mudflat of Fukuoka that you see here at the lower left-hand corner of the slide is from this year's Summer Youth Exchange Program, where FOFA organized 3-day activities. While in the past, most Sister City activities focused on Japanese traditions, such as participating in a tea ceremony or wearing kimono, or Japanese traditional clothing, this year we made a conscious decision to include activities in natural environments and to collaborate with local organizations and schools that are working on environmental conservation and research. Our intention was to let the participating students feel the culture seep through such environments and how they are taken care of, and to have opportunities to have a shared experience of enjoying nature together, which transcends language barrier. The watershed tour of Fukuoka, which was a 1-day activity I was in charge of planning and coordinating, was very well received by the participating students from both Japan and the US. In our survey, we received many comments on how enjoyable to be out in the mudflat looking at the shorebirds and critters in the mud together. And they wish they had more time to explore the mudflats together and enjoy some snacks together too. These comments show that shared commonalities and uniqueness were well received, and natural environment brought the students together. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Honomi. And this sort of Pacific Rim informal conversations about watersheds between California and Hawaii, and actually Pearl Harbor and Japan bring up all the trauma in all those places, which is still very present. So thanks so much, and we'd be happy to have question and answers now if anyone has any.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. It is not something that we actually host at this channel very often, because we are usually talking about strict psychological research done in a very strict methodological way. And that is actually, when I think about post-traumatic growth, mental health, and stress, that is how I analyze it, starting from the individual, applying certain tests and so on, to then actually drawing conclusions on the population. So it was really interesting to hear something that's coming outside of the box. So I'm open to comments and questions as usual. If you don't want your voice to be heard, you are also free to type it in the chat, and then I will read it aloud, and then we will discuss it. Otherwise, just raise your hand and just start discussing.
I have a question. I don't know if this is a useful exercise, but from my own thinking, so you were describing the concept as this being kind of a form of collective PTSD, and I'm wondering if it's more a continuous stress disorder as opposed to post-traumatic, it sounds kind of as though you're talking about the existing systems as they function. And I'm wondering if you can kind of compare the idea that you're putting forward to the idea of PTSD specifically, if you've done that, and if that would be helpful.
Maybe I could respond to that a little bit. The idea of PTSD is commonly known, whereas the continuous stress idea, which was the stress which I was talking about as attachment injury stress and trauma, is not very common in the public sphere. So the term was to be, we developed it. We used a lot of different terms before settling on that term: authoritarian stress overload, authoritarian stress syndrome. Finally, we used the term condition. But the idea was people are familiar with PTSD, so we'll associate it with PTSD. But however, my description of the authoritarian stress condition, I talked about the attachment injuries, which can be very minor and which we saw in the video, and which establish a kind of pattern of ongoing re-traumatization and normalizing let's say a military solution is a normal solution. It's nothing but a trauma solution. So the idea is, your understanding of the idea as an ongoing stress and an ongoing trauma system is accurate. And that's why we talked about understanding and acknowledging pain and responding to it as one would understand responding to trauma, and especially in systems where you become trauma informed. But psychologically, we can't separate ourselves from society, community, social, or environment, even though the world of psychology has. The world of psychology is almost functioned on the individual as if it's a shell, and beyond the shell, outside the shell, doesn't exist. But our brain doesn't function that way. Our brain functions in this interplay mechanism. And so the authoritarian stress condition is an extension of that interplay, which, when given the holding environment, is the capacity to thrive, provides the capacity to thrive. So there's the kind of relationship. And so authoritarian system is also better understood in relationship to the holding environment in that sense. That's my response.
Thank you.
That's a very good question, Lynn, because there's just the way we've built our environment is ongoing stress. And so that's why when Honomi had the kids go away from the symbols of authority, I mean, one of the things they do is go up to the tallest tower in Fukuoka and look out, oh, look at the city. But we didn't evolve with tall towers and monuments. We evolved in small settings, and we evolved in settings in which you had agency, and that almost everything around you is, quote, natural. So these cities with concrete and nothing natural are constantly stressful. And there are someone from Scandinavia did wonderful drawings of cities where the roads are deep crevasses, and the crosswalks, are little shaky bridges. So just this in cities, just the outside your front door is stressful. I mean, more people are killed just in 1 year in the United States on the streets than everyone in the Second World War. So, so it's much, our life, and then there's the background of all the other wars going on and all the other violence. So that's the kind of daily stress we're used to.
You mean every American, not everyone in the Second World War, I think.
Oh, yeah, maybe it's just the amount of number of Americans killed in the Second World War.
But that's a good, Robin's comment gives you a good description of authoritarian stress condition. It's built into the way we conceive our built environment and the way we undermine our natural world.
And also, our administration is no one feels they have any access to how things are happening in the world. Oh, yeah, Greg, you had a question. Sorry.
No, I was just reflecting on back in the early 70s when in Berkeley with the radical psychiatry movement, there was a formulation of, I think, kind of parallel to the authoritarian stress condition, of the idea that people become alienated from each other and from their conditions when they're oppressed and mystified about the sources of that oppression. And it was very formulaic, but the kind of the solution or the response to that was to connect with other people. So instead of that isolation, you're more connected, you're organized, and you're having the knowledge of those sources and then organizing against it. But it's like building a resiliency and reserves and resources to solve problems and to have that attachment and connection with people. I'm just seeing some parallels from the framework that you're presenting with some of the old ideas I was exposed to back then. But it's an ongoing issue with that idea of being alienated from others and that need to connect with both our world and each other to change the direction, but also looking at how people become used as objects for others' benefit rather than collaborative stuff. It becomes a zero-sum game, and that concentration of resources and control. I think that's another element of what of that authoritarian stress condition that you're describing.
It's also a coping mechanism when you've been traumatized, is you want to get control of your world. You feel your world is out of control. And so that's what being trauma informed is about. And that's what we meant by these are inadvertent situations we find ourselves in, because our reactions to those conditions are to shrink back, separate ourselves, and try and get control. And that's what kids do. And that's where developmental rest begins to move in, because it doesn't work because we are attachment configured beings, animals. We saw that in the video.
So we're running out of time, and I wanted to ask Alma, from the APA perspective, you were talking about how this is sort of outside the box, and this actually is our debut into the general world. And as far as I can tell, this is not in any box anywhere, actually. But it sort of describes the whole box. And so I guess our question is there, do you see any way of collaborating with any part of the APA any further in, with these concepts?
Well, I cannot really talk for the whole APA for sure. And even in terms of division, I'm just running this student and early career committee. So I can refer to maybe one of the last slides where you were talking about weird and non-weird science, especially psychological science. And I can say that what we are trying to do in APA Division 48, and particularly through this Student and Early Career Committee, is to bring as many members as possible who are going to be international members, so non-American members, probably coming from developing countries, from Europe, Asia, and Africa. And I myself co-established a BRIR, which is like, I can easily say like a first consortium of psychological researchers coming from developing countries. And we are also trying to have like, to have collaboration between the Global South and the Global North in order to increase the participation of psychological researchers from developing countries in big team science and psychological science, and in order to work on replication crisis. And besides that, on decolonization of psychological science. So with these also series that I'm planning for the next year, I'm trying to establish some sort of connection between ABRIR sub-branch called ABRIR Peace, which is mostly like peace researchers from the Global South, and APA Division 48, and to see how we can actually establish something. Thankfully, we have a Zoom, and we can do things like online, so we don't really have to be at the same place all the time, which actually reduces the cost, because cost of traveling to conferences, to scientific events, are something that preventing researchers from the Global South to actually attend and to participate. I'm talking also from my perspective. I'm like originally from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was educated both in the Global South and Global North. I'm currently working in the Global North, but my mission is actually to help all those who are now in the Global South actually to learn, study psychology, and to engage in all the activities that Global North can freely engage. So I see that potential here.
Yeah, well, yeah, that anyway you're doing is really important. And one of our colleagues who was just at an international conference, she's just about to turn 30, I guess, from her family's from the Philippines and African American and Japanese mix, I guess. But she was pointing out at this sort of academic conference that was, all these people were talking about people in the, marginalized people, but they didn't have the voice. They weren't paying attention to the voices of the marginalized people themselves. But she said one person did get to speak and pointed out that the results of what we're calling the authoritarian stress condition, which, the apocalyptic results, all these people who aren't part of weird science are living in that dystopia of having had their cultures and places ruined already. That the weird, mainstream is worrying about, what's going to happen if we blow ourselves up. And here half the world is already experiencing that. So, that's sort of, so that there's a lot of information that it could be shared, like what you're saying, I think, with, the people whose voices haven't been in the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that is also the learning curve that goes both sides, because lots of is happening in psychology in the Global South, but actually there is Global North doesn't have access to it due to mostly language barriers, but also like some people have cognitive barriers, so they don't really want to know anything outside of the Ivy League or R1 institutions. So basically that is also the thing that we want to emphasize, like what is really happening there and how we can bring those researchers and their voices to the current mainstream science.
Oh, and share access to all the structures that exist in the weird science. Yeah. I think that's essential. Oh, that's great. Well, if there's any way we can help with that, I know Denzel wrote to me that, and to both, I guess to both of us, if there's any way he could help, he would be interested.
I see
but,
Denzel is with us, so Denzel, if you want to say something now, like, oh yeah, he's just typed in the chat that he's very much interested. Yeah, to collaborate, so that's great. So if there are no other questions and points for discussion, I would like to thank our speakers for their time and for the presentation. I would like to thank to the audience. I hope that those of you who are like outside of these time zones will be watching this on demand on our YouTube channel. I will stop recording now, and then I will actually upload this video to our YouTube channel and send an email to all of you so that you can find it on the link. Should you have any questions related to this, you can always like contact our presenters. As you see, they're open to collaboration. So if you have like any sort of ideas for collaboration, please contact them directly and discuss that. In terms of student and early career committee, we are always like ready to collaborate with open-minded people who are like there to bring some new insights. I hope that all of you had a good time with us, and I hope that you will be joining our activities from the next year on. Until then, like stay safe and have a good time. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.